The dime that changed everything. Why Frank Sinatra carried 10 coins to his grave. The scream didn't come from Frank Sinatra Jr.'s mouth. It came from the payphone, a mechanical shriek that cut through the Lake Tahoe night like a blade through silk. December 8th, 1963. 11:47 p.m., Frank Sinatra Sr. was holding a black rotary phone in the Mapes Hotel, his knuckles white, his famous blue eyes filled with terror. He had just heard his 19-year-old son's voice for the first time since the kidnapping. 3 words. Dad, I'm scared. And then that sound, that electronic death rattle. The line had gone dead. Not because the kidnappers hung up, not because the FBI cut the connection. The call ended because a dime had run out in a payphone somewhere in the Nevada desert. 10 cents. The price of keeping a father and son connected. The price Frank Sinatra would carry in his pocket for the rest of his life. Frank Sinatra was the most powerful entertainer on the planet. He could make presidents, return his calls, he could fill any stadium, he could snap his fingers and make grown men tremble. But at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday night in 1963, Frank Sinatra learned that all the money in the world couldn't buy him 10 cents when he needed it most. This is the story of how a missing dime broke the chairman of the board, how it led to a war between the FBI and the Chicago outfit, how it turned Frank Sinatra into a man who never trusted anything again, and why, when they buried him 35 years later, his daughter placed 10 dimes in his coffin, just in case he needed to make one last call. 6 hours earlier, Frank Jr. was eating a steak dinner in room 417 at Harrah's Club Lodge. He was nervous. Tomorrow night, he was supposed to open for his father in Las Vegas. It was the break he had been working toward his entire life, the chance to step out of the shadow and into the spotlight. He was practicing his song list in his head when someone knocked on the door. Room service, a voice said. But Frank Jr. hadn't ordered room service. John Foss, the trumpet player eating with him, walked to the door. He looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark coats. They looked like hotel staff. Foss opened the door. The first man through was Barry Keenan, 23 years old, a failed nightclub owner with a drug habit and a gun. The second was Joe Amsler, shorter, nervous, sweating despite the cold. They weren't hotel staff. They weren't professionals. They were desperate amateurs who had decided that kidnapping Frank Sinatra's son would solve their money problems. Keenan pointed a .38 revolver at Frank Jr.'s chest. "Get up. You're coming with us." Frank Jr. looked at the gun. He looked at the men. And for the first time in his sheltered life, he understood that money and fame meant nothing to people with nothing left to lose. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was steady. Keenan smiled. It was not a nice smile. "We want your father to remember what it's like to be powerless." They tied up John Foss with bedsheets. They blindfolded Frank Jr. with a pillowcase. They led him down the back stairs, through the kitchen, and into the trunk of a 1963 Chevrolet Impala. The last thing Frank Jr. saw before the world went black was snow falling on the parking lot. Beautiful, peaceful snow that looked like confetti, like celebration, like freedom. Frank Sinatra was in Palm Springs when he got the call. He was sitting by his pool, reading the trades, enjoying the quiet. The phone rang. He almost didn't answer it, but something about the urgency of the ring, the way it cut through the desert silence, made him pick up. "Mr. Sinatra." The voice was cold, professional, terrifying. "This is Special Agent William Bond with the FBI. I'm calling about your son." Frank's blood turned to ice water. "What about my son?" "He's been taken, Mr. Sinatra, kidnapped from his hotel room. We need you in Nevada immediately." The phone slipped from Frank's hand. It hit the concrete with a crack that echoed across the water. For 30 seconds, Frank Sinatra sat in his chair, staring at nothing, trying to process the impossible. His boy was gone. Someone had stolen his boy. Frank Sinatra flew to Nevada in a private jet at 2 in the morning. He sat in the leather seat, smoking cigarette after cigarette, his hands shaking so badly he could barely light them. This was his fault. He knew it. He had made enemies, powerful enemies. Men who couldn't touch Frank directly but could hurt him by hurting the people he loved. Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, the Chicago outfit. Had one of them ordered this? Was this payback for some imagined slight? Frank closed his eyes and tried to think. Who wanted to destroy him badly enough to take his son? The list was long and terrifying. In Reno, the Mapes Hotel had been transformed into a war room. FBI agents filled the lobby. Phone taps were being installed. Maps of Nevada covered every table. And in the penthouse suite, Frank Sinatra paced like a caged animal, chain-smoking, his famous composure completely shattered. Agent Dean Elson, the FBI's point man on kidnapping cases, was trying to brief him. "Mr. Sinatra, we need to establish some ground rules. No contact with organized crime figures. No unauthorized negotiations with the kidnappers. No paying any ransom without our approval." Frank stopped pacing. He looked at Elson with eyes that could have melted steel. "You don't tell me what to do when my son's life is on the line. You find him. That's your job. Finding him is mine." Frank did exactly what the FBI told him not to do. He called Sam Giancana. Momo picked up on the first ring like he had been waiting by the phone. "Frank, I heard. We're already looking." "Sam, if this is connected to—" "It's not," Giancana interrupted. "Nobody in our thing would touch your boy. That's off limits, but we're going to find out who did. And when we find them, they're going to wish they were never born." "I don't want them hurt," Frank said. "I just want my son back." There was silence on the line. Then Giancana laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound. "Frank, you got a good heart, but sometimes good hearts get people killed. These men took your boy. You think they're going to give him back because you ask nice?" The line went quiet again. Frank could hear his own heartbeat. "What are you saying, Sam?" "I'm saying we do this the Chicago way, fast and permanent, or we do it the FBI way, slow and stupid. Your choice." Frank hung up on his oldest friend. He couldn't have the mob involved. Not this time. This was too important, too dangerous. If the newspapers found out that the Chicago outfit was hunting his son's kidnappers, the story would never end. Frank Jr. would spend the rest of his life being known as the kid who was saved by the mafia. Frank wouldn't let that happen. So he chose the FBI and immediately regretted it. The agents were competent but cautious. They wanted to trace calls, analyze evidence, build a case. Frank wanted to tear apart Nevada with his bare hands until he found his boy. The waiting was killing him. Every minute that passed was another minute his son was in danger. Every hour was another hour that the kidnappers might decide Junior was too much trouble to keep alive. At 11:30 p.m., the phone rang. Frank lunged for it like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. "Hello?" "We have your son." The voice was electronically distorted, cold, inhuman. "We want $240,000. Used bills. Nothing bigger than a 20. No sequential numbers." "I'll give you $1 million," Frank screamed into the phone. "I'll give you everything I have. Just don't hurt him, please." "We don't want $1 million. We want exactly what we asked for. Are you listening?" "Yes. Yes, I'm listening." "Good. Now we're going to let you talk to him. Prove he's alive, but keep it short." There was silence. Then rustling. Then a voice Frank would have recognized. Anywhere. Young. Scared. Trying to be brave. "Dad." Frank's knees buckled. He gripped the phone so hard his knuckles went white. Junior, are you okay? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay, Dad. I'm not hurt. But they have guns and—" "Listen to me," Frank interrupted. "These men want money. I'm going to give them money. You're going to come home. Do you understand me? You're coming home." "Dad, I'm scared." Those 3 words. The 3 words that would haunt Frank Sinatra for the rest of his life. His son. His brave, talented, good-hearted son, scared and alone and depending on his father to save him. "I know you're scared, but I'm going to fix this. I promise you. I'm going to—" And then that sound. That mechanical shriek. The payphone running out of money. The connection dying. The line going dead. Frank stared at the receiver. He heard the dial tone buzzing in his ear like an angry wasp. "Hello?" he said into the dead line. "Hello? Are you there?" Nothing. The FBI agents around him were frantically working their tracing equipment, but Frank knew they had lost the signal. The kidnappers were calling from payphones to avoid being traced. They were moving from location to location, and they had just run out of dimes. Frank slammed the phone down so hard it cracked. "They hung up," he told the agents, but Agent Elson shook his head. "No, Mr. Sinatra. The connection was lost. Probably a payphone. They'll call back." Frank looked at him with pure rage. "A payphone? My son's life is hanging by a thread, and it's connected to a goddamn payphone." He walked to the window and stared out at the snow-covered mountains. Somewhere out there, in the dark, his boy was tied up in a car or a motel room, waiting for his father to save him. And Frank had been cut off because someone didn't have 10 cents. The kidnappers called back 20 minutes later. The deal was simple: $240,000 in a brown leather satchel. Frank would drive to Los Angeles alone. More instructions would follow. Frank wanted to make the delivery himself. He wanted to look the kidnappers in the eye. He wanted to be there when his son was released, but the FBI overruled him. "Too dangerous," Agent Elson said. "If they see you, they might panic, might shoot." So Frank sat in the hotel room, smoking, waiting, going insane. The money was prepared. The satchel was packed. A FBI agent named Robert Brostrom would make the drop. Frank had to trust a stranger to save his son's life. The drop was made on December 11th, a highway between two school buses in Bel Air. Brostrom left the satchel and drove away, as instructed. Then came the longest 4 hours in Frank Sinatra's life. No contact from the kidnappers, no word about Junior, nothing but silence and snow and the terrible possibility that he would never see his son again. Frank prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He made promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "Bring back my boy," he whispered to the ceiling, "and I'll be better. I'll be the father he deserves. Just bring him home." At 2:47 a.m., the phone rang one last time. Frank grabbed it. "Yes? Your son has been released." Frank didn't ask where, didn't ask how. He just said, "Is he safe?" "He's safe. He's walking to a gas station on Mulholland Drive. The police have been notified." Frank hung up the phone and collapsed into his chair. For the first time in 4 days, he let himself cry. His boy was alive. His boy was coming home. It was over, but Frank Sinatra was not the same man who had answered the phone 4 days earlier. The kidnapping had changed him, hardened him, taught him that fame and money were no protection against the random cruelty of desperate people. He had learned that everything he cared about could be taken away by strangers with guns and a willingness to use them. Frank Jr. was found walking down Mulholland Drive at 3:15 a.m., cold and tired, but unharmed. When Frank Sr. arrived at the police station, he saw his son sitting on a bench, wearing the same clothes he had been kidnapped in, looking older than his 19 years. They didn't speak at first. Frank just walked over and wrapped his arms around his boy and held him until they both stopped shaking. "I'm sorry, Dad," Junior whispered. "I'm sorry this happened." Frank pulled back and looked at his son's face. He saw fear there, and guilt, and something else. Strength. His boy had survived, had been brave, had come home. "Don't you ever apologize," Frank said. "Don't you ever apologize for being alive." The kidnappers were caught within days. Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, and a third man named John Irwin. They were young, stupid, and completely unprepared for the heat that came down on them. Most of the ransom money was recovered. They were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. Justice was served, but the nightmare wasn't over. The defense attorneys came up with a strategy so twisted, so cruel, that it nearly broke Frank all over again. They claimed the kidnapping was a hoax, that Frank Jr. had arranged his own kidnapping to boost his singing career. They dragged the boy through the mud in open court, calling him a liar and a con artist. Frank sat in the courtroom and watched his traumatized son be called a fraud. He wanted to strangle the defense attorneys with his bare hands. The jury didn't believe the hoax story. The kidnappers were convicted, but the damage was done. There were whispers in Hollywood, jokes on late-night television, questions that followed Frank Jr. for years. The kidnapping had made him famous, but not in the way he wanted. He was no longer Frank Sinatra's talented son. He was Frank Sinatra's kidnapped son, the boy who may or may not have staged his own crime. It was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life, and Frank Sr. never forgave the people who put it on him. But the most profound change was small and private and secret. From December 11th, 1963, until May 14th, 1998, the day he died, Frank Sinatra carried 10 dimes in his pocket. Every day, every performance, every recording session, every dinner party, every meeting with presidents and kings and mobsters. 10 dimes. People noticed the weight in his jacket, the quiet jingling when he walked. They asked him about it. He never answered, never explained. Some people thought it was a gambling superstition. Others thought it was a tip for coat check girls. A few close friends guessed it had something to do with phone calls, but nobody knew the truth. Nobody knew that every dime was a memory of that moment when the line went dead, when his connection to his son was severed by something as trivial as pocket change. 10 dimes. The price of staying connected. The price of never being helpless again. Frank Sinatra was a complicated man. He could be generous and cruel, loyal and vindictive, tender and violent. But the kidnapping revealed the core of who he was. Beneath the tuxedo and the swagger and the chairman of the board persona, he was just a father from Hoboken who loved his kids more than his own life. The 10 dimes were his insurance policy against powerlessness. His promise that he would never again be cut off when someone he loved needed him. Every night before bed, he would empty his pockets and count them. 10 dimes. Still there. Still ready. Still protecting him from the silence. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, he was buried in a blue suit with satin lapels. He had a bottle of Jack Daniels tucked into one pocket, a pack of Camel cigarettes in another, a Zippo lighter engraved with his initials, and in his breast pocket, placed there by his daughter Nancy, with tears streaming down her face, 10 dimes. Wrapped in tissue paper, placed over his heart, just in case he needed to make a call from wherever he was going. Just in case the line went dead again and he needed to reconnect. 10 small silver coins, the final protection against the silence that had terrified him for 35 years. The kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. lasted 54 hours, but its effects lasted a lifetime. It turned the most confident man in America into someone who checked his pockets before leaving the house, who always carried exact change, who never, ever trusted a phone to stay connected when it mattered most. The world saw Frank Sinatra as the chairman of the board, the king of the hill, the man who did it his way. But Frank saw himself as a father who had almost lost everything because he didn't have 10 cents. So he made sure he always had 10 cents. And 10 more after that. Insurance against helplessness, protection against silence. A pocket full of peace of mind that jingled softly when he walked, reminding him and everyone around him that Frank Sinatra was always ready to make the call that mattered, even if it was his last one.